The original penitentiary was started in 1897. The entrance would have been somewhere in this general vicinity, but this particular entrance was in existence between 1904 and 1909 when this building was actually constructed. That would have been, it's commonly referred to now as the second gate. This building is a building. It's the oldest cell block at the institution. It was built in 1904 and it was entered in 1905 by housing 672 inmates. In 1909, this building, the administration building, was attached to it. It was referred to as the Armory and Guard House because the officers used the third floor of the building for living quarters. When the building was built in 1904, of course, they had a plaque placed in the cement here that named the construction company and the date the building was actually built. It was built in 1904, but again, it wasn't used, and inmates were not received into the building until the spring of 1905, and they received 672 inmates at that particular time.
This area here is where employees would enter and exit. When you enter the institution, before you could go through these bars, they would shake you down. You would come in, the officer would ask you to remove everything from out of your pockets, and he would place those items on the desk. He would frisk you, give you a pat search of everything. He would go through your wallet, your pockets. He'd give you a complete search to make sure you aren't bringing any contraband or anything of that nature into the institution. After you've been searched, the officer would release you and let you go through the gate. After you've been through, he would close the gate. And coming back through, he would use this Folger Adams key in order to let you out of the gate. These are holding cells. They were used to house inmates when they were entering and exiting the institution. We would place the inmates in the holding cells until the front area was secure for the inmate to go through. That means everything up front had to be locked before we could release an inmate to go through the front gate. That would prevent him from going to the armory and getting weapons or going into communication, hitting the button so the other inmates could be released and things of that nature.
Now, this is cell building A. It was built in 1904 and it was first occupied in the spring of 1905. They moved in 672 inmates. The building is a 5-tier cell block. It has 336 cells, and the shower rooms was located in the west basement section of the building. For the first 70 years, the inmates had to be scheduled to go outside and down to the basement for the showers. In 1975 or 76, the cell block was renovated, whereas the shower rooms was closed and the shower stalls was placed in one cell on each of the tiers in each of the 4 sections. In 1952, the building was divided into 2 sections, the east side and the west side. And then in 1976, it was further divided into 4 different sections. This particular cell block was pretty modern in its time. It didn't have individual locks on the cell bars. The doors were shut by roller. They would crank the cell shut by one end and a chain would pull all the doors shut. They do have hasp on them, but that was for the inmates' use in order to put padlocks on them. The other cell blocks, of course, have individual locks on the cells. This particular cell block was built with the intent of having 2 men per cell. And it had 2 men per cell from the time it was built up until, again, about 18 years ago, about 1976, when it was reduced to 1 man per cell. During the period of about 1939, when the women's quarters was being discontinued and B building was under construction, then there were times when it would be as many as 3 men per cell, 2 men on a bunk and 1 on the floor. However, during that particular time, inmates didn't possess all that personal property that they would at this particular time. This building was the first building at the penitentiary to have electric lights and running water. All the other buildings had buckets for toilet facilities, and the electric power was generated at the power plant located on site. This is a 5-tier cell block, and the cells are separate from the perimeter walls of the cell building. That is, there's a space of 7 to 8 feet at the top of the cells to the ceiling. And of course, this building has an attic. When the building was divided into 4 sections, it was found that inmates could possibly swing from the upper cell on top of the cell block to visit with other inmates from the other side. So it was necessary to put some concertina wire up on top to prevent inmates from becoming involved in activities on the top of the cell block. All of the cell blocks, due to the fact that that's a perimeter wall of the cell building, and we had the long windows almost from floor length to the ceilings, there was a track all the way around the entire cell block that was used for the purpose of cleaning windows. They would put a boatswain type seat on that track, and you could go from top to bottom and clean the windows. This building, of course, has never had air conditioning, but they just had different forms of heat. In later years, of course, it had forced hot air heat, and the ventilation was vented through the plumbing spaces behind the cells. That is, each cell had a vent that would draw the warm air from behind the cells. The cell building really, during the hot summer months, really was not as warm as you might expect. There's been a number of renovations through the years to this particular building, and one of them several years ago was to remove the bars from this height up to the top of the next cell. This entire area was solid bar grill work.
Inside the cells, they had a sink or toilet and a bed and a cabinet in order to place their property in. The sink didn't have hot water. All it had was cold running water. In order for the inmates to get their hot water, they had to come out of their cells and go to the sink or to the shower in order to get their hot water. They used to wash their clothes and things of that nature in buckets. They had 5-gallon buckets where the inmates would take and do his laundry, and you would come through any time of the day and you would see his clothes hanging on the rail. They also had antennas hanging out of their cells so they could get a better reception on their television, since there's very poor reception inside of this building. But throughout the course of the day, the inmates would just be out hanging out in the section. There would be just one officer patrolling the entire section while the inmates were out. And the officer didn't have a gun or any weapon like that. The only weapon that he had was his stick and a radio. The inmates had the liberty to enter and exit out of their cell as they chose throughout the course of the day. They were not locked in all day long. We would let them out approximately 7 o'clock in the morning. They would wait out and come out, wash up and shower until they were called to breakfast around 7:30. After they ate breakfast, they would report back to the cell and wait here until they were to report to work or to school or wherever they were to report to. Some inmates did not go to school or to work. Some remained inside the cells. The ones who did not work or go to school, they were classified as deadheads, so they just stayed in this section all day. During the course of the day, you would come in here and there would be picnic benches lined up along the wall, and inmates would be playing cards or checkers, chess, dominoes, things of that nature, all types of games, recreation activities. You can see on the wall there's a box, and that box housed a television. The state provided them with a television for those inmates who could not afford to have one in their cells. Inmates would be out during the course of the day, so you may walk around and go by a cell and see 2 or 3, 4 or 5 inmates in one cell. They weren't restricted as far as their movement inside the section. They could not go out of this section and into another section, but they could roam around. They could roam around freely inside of their particular section. During the course of the day, we had inmate workers in here, and there would be a worker assigned to each level. Like this level here is the yard, 100 tier, 200 tier, 300 tier, and 400 tier. That's how they label them. And we did not house inmates according to their crime or according to their sentence. We housed them basically according to available space. But if there was an inmate who came in, he was elderly or handicapped or had some kind of illness, then we would try to place him down on the bottom level, whereas he wouldn't have any difficulty climbing the stairs and things of that nature. It was like an unwritten law where another inmate could not come in or walk through the cell house and stop and look in another inmate's cell unless he had a reason to. They were like we are. You know, I wouldn't want my neighbor to come to my house and peek in my window, and the inmates feel the same way. They enjoyed their privacy, although they weren't allowed to have anything on their cells. You can clearly see is clearly visible inside the cell. You can see every square foot inside the cell, but they didn't appreciate another inmate coming by and looking inside of their cell. This is the opening and closing mechanisms that were used to lock the inmates in and release them. Okay, the doors are open now, I'm gonna close it for you. I pull it and lock the cell doors, turn this crank in order to force the doors to close, so they would close simultaneously in order to lock the inmates in. So all the cell doors are closing at the same time. So that means all the cell doors are locked now. And I would look out this hole to make sure all the inmates are in their cells and all the cell doors are locked. If they aren't locked, I would holler down there, or if the inmate's out of his cell, I would holler down there, hey, report to your cell, report to your cell. This is the officer's cage area. No inmates were never allowed in this area. This was totally off limits to inmates. The officer would also, from this area, observe the section. As you can see from this area, he can see two sections. He can see the section on his left, which would be the east yard, and to his right, which would be the west yard. He can observe the officer and the inmate in both sections. This is the break area. This is where we control the water and the electricity that flows into each inmate's cell. There's a valve and electrical switch that controls each individual cell, which is inside the break area. Take, for instance, if we had a tip that an inmate had some contraband, which is anything that's not allowed inside of the institution, and we didn't want the inmate to get rid of it, we would come in the break area, find the inmate's cell, turn the water off to the inmate's toilet so that the inmate could not flush the contraband into the toilet, and then we'd go inside the inmate's cell and see if he had contraband or not.
This was the inmate's visiting room that was used between 1905 up until the 70s as the non-contact visiting area. That is, the inmate sat on that side of the petition and the visitor sat on this side. However, prior to the discontinuing this room about 1976, the petition was taken down and the inmates and visitors were allowed to sit at tables and have contact visited, which has been in effect to date. This section of the visiting room was used for visitation by those assigned to death row. This door would have been lowered and the door on the other side would have been lowered, and the inmate and his visitor would visit through a screen. In later years, for the last 10 or 15 years, after executions was resumed in 1982, the non-contact area was used for inmates on death row visiting their families.
This is where the inmates received their visits. If the visitor had children or it was a family, they would visit on the yellow side. But if it was a single person and they were all adults, they would visit on the blue side. They would separate the family visits and the children from the adults for the simple reason they didn't want the children to be exposed to the type of behavior that would be carried on by two adults. They were allowed to bring food in on visiting days, and visiting days were Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. The food that they would bring in would be searched by the officers. They also searched the individuals thoroughly also. Children, adults, everybody was searched the same. The visitors would bring the food in. but the inmates were not allowed to take anything out of the visiting room. They were not even allowed to bring anything into the visiting room. They were not allowed to wear coats in the visiting room, hats, or even have combs in the visiting room. All of them would be taken away by the officers before they entered into the visiting room. And when they came out of the visiting room, they were strip searched before they were allowed to return to the cell house. There most definitely was a lot of heavy eating in there, and I think that was the most enjoyable time for the inmates during visiting times. Take, for instance, if there was going to be a disturbance, they would always take into consideration when visiting days were. So they would either cause a disturbance after the visitation day or few days before, so that if anything was going to occur, or if there was going to be a lockdown or something of that nature, it would not have any effect on their visit.
This is a complex building, but it's sitting on the exact same site as the original Latrobe cell building that was built in 1800 for 200 prisoners. Between the period of 1927 and 1929, the building was taken down in sections, and this building was erected. It was used for a hospital. The right wing is a location of the mess hall, and the basement was the food preparation area. And the second floor was the chapel, and it's still been used for a chapel. It was until the building was closed. There was a plaque hanging in the archway of this building that indicated that the building was built in 1929 from the bricks that was used in the original building that was designed by Thomas Jefferson. We found out later that the building was actually designed by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who was also the architect for the U.S. Capitol.
I'm a consultant working for Telemark Incorporated in Fairfax. I've been hired by CRSS and Ethyl Corporation to first do the background research to see if I thought there might be something left of the 1797 Latrobe Penitentiary. And then, since the background research revealed that there might be something here, we're doing a testing program to see if we can find any of the remains of it. And we have found some brick foundations, some interesting circular features that we're trying to, circular brick features that we're trying to identify right now.
This area here was used to recreate the death row inmates. They would bring the death row inmate out here, place him in this area here. He would be in full restraints when they bring him from out of the death chamber. He would have on handcuffs, leg irons, and waist chain. And once he was in this area, they would remove all of his restraints and let him recreate up in this area here for an hour. They would also put additional security up on the walls for the inmates. They would arm the officers with rifles, shotguns, and a .38 in order for additional security. Basically, all they did was just walk around the area. The purpose for that was just to give them some fresh air and to let them have a feel of outside.
This is just outside of the original perimeter wall. The recreation field was added to the penitentiary in the late 40s, probably about 1949. The perimeter was extended on down to the point that the end of this field, and then in later years the mess hall was constructed. The bleachers was built out of the old houses that was bought with the property and torn down. During the time that I was warden of this place, during about this time of year, it was a very cold day. I was called from the back to say that the ball field had caved in. And when I got back here, about in the center of the field, there's a great sunken place. And that's when we discovered that there was a sewer line or drain line of some sort, very large, ran the extent of the field. It had caved in, and but we also learned that it had been capped off at the other end. We thought when it first caved in that it actually was still an active, at least I thought it was still an active drain source, so we tried to get it back to the city of Richmond, but they said that when the interstate was put through the 2nd Street, down to 2nd Street, that the end of the sewer had been capped off, so therefore there was no danger of a hole being opened up in the wall that would allow inmates to escape from the area.
You can see down there, there's the boxing ring, which will have some excellent boxers housed in this institution, a basketball court, softball field. They also had a football field, but as you can see, the field is really not 100 yards long. What they would do, they would mark the football field 50 yards, and after they traveled the first 50 yards, they would bring the ball back and travel the other 50 yards in order to make a touchdown. They had thousands of pounds of weights housed in this area here, and there would be inmates out here all day long lifting weights. Some of those inmates were so big they would make Mr. Universe look like a wimp.
In fact, the matter, when they played baseball, we had to put some chicken wire at the top of the wall so that the balls would try to catch the balls. Otherwise, if the balls went over that wall, there were usually some local children that would pick up the balls, bring them back to the front gate and sell them back to us, which was a pretty good deal in the long run.
Throughout the institution, you can see there are a number of wall posts. There's nowhere inside the institution where you cannot be seen by an officer in a wall post. In the wall post, the type of weapons that they housed, they had a .38, a Mini 14, which is a high-powered rifle, average range approximately 700 yards, and a 12-gauge shotgun, and a number of different types of gases. This area here housed recreational activities such as band. They had a band room, a soundproof band room, as a matter of fact. They had an inmate band within the institution that traveled to other institutions that performed for them. They also performed here at the functions that they had for the inmates. This area also housed the arts and crafts room, which inmates would make anything from a belt, jewelry box, grandfather clocks, and things of that nature. They also had weights, boxing activities, pool table, all sorts of recreation activities were performed in this area.
This is the 2nd floor of the east wing of the complex building, and it was built for the chapel, and it is mainly used from 1927 to date as a chapel. It accommodated the various denominations and with office space for the different denominations of ministers. The building's gone through a number of phases. In the olden days, primarily you had Catholic and Protestant services, but of course in later years with the Muslim faith, then the building had to be altered to some degree in that half of the pews were taken from the chapel area. The religious ornaments were removed or made so that they could be removed during the time that the Muslims were having their services, and of course they were put back during the Catholic and Protestant services. The construction of the mess hall was completed in 1957 and put into use in 1957. At that particular time, the population was probably between 17 and 1,800 inmates, and the seats was arranged with 7 rows of stainless steel seats, all facing this direction. 8 men per table. It stayed that way up until the early 70s, and all the stainless steel tables was removed and replaced with 4-man tables and chairs that could be moved from side to side. And the purpose of that was so that the tables and chairs could be moved off to the side, and this area would then be used as an indoor recreation, primarily basketball. However, under normal operations, and even after it was used for that, movies were shown on weekends, Saturday and Sundays, and the windows had blinds on them so that they could be shut to darken the area for the showing of the movies.
They also allowed different organizations from off the street to come play inmates in certain sports, softball, basketball, all non-contact sports, of course. They also allowed the officers in to play inmates in certain types of sports. The inmates would enter the mess hall, walk along the line behind the rail up to the counter where they would be served by inmates under the supervision of an employee. The food would also be cooked by inmates under the supervision of employees. They also provided for inmates who participated in different types of religion and different cultural types of activities, such as the Muslims during Ramadan season. They would feed them before the sun came up and after the sun went down. For the Muslims who had vegetarian type of diets, they fed them things like a head of lettuce, a cucumber, an onion, celery, all vegetarian type foods.
This is the basement of the mess hall. This was a food preparation area. And we're standing right now in the bakery area. This was an oil-fired oven, and this was the location of all the dough mixers and things of that nature. In one of the rooms to the right was the ranges and the steam pots, and on up through the corridor was the storerooms, freezers, and areas of that nature. This is the area that was used to bring in the food stuff into the mess hall, into the storerooms. The food would be delivered through the west or east truck gate. And of course, at the end of the day, the garbage was also collected in this particular area. And at the end of the day, this particular area was closed up and secured for the night. On one particular occasion, about 10 years ago, or along about 1970 or 80, during the summer, 2 inmates managed to hide out in the garbage bags that was piled around to the end of the building. And after the count was all cleared, they swung a hook over the wall and managed to swing up on the wall through a rope made out of bed sheets. And they got over the wall. The officer failed to stop them. And we looked for the 2 inmates throughout the night in the Richmond area. And the next day, the 2 men were picked up in the Charlottesville area. We picked up a couple of investigators and went up to identify them. And of course, they were our 2 escapees. And the preliminary investigation revealed that the 2 inmates had made it to Charlottesville, and in an effort to get out of the area had managed to steal a car, and it turned out they stole my wife's uncle's car. The mess hall was all built outside of the old perimeter. When the perimeter wall was extended down in the direction of 2nd Street, and the mess hall was constructed. Of course, first off, they built the recreation field, and then the mess hall was built in the recreation field. In fact, it was just attached on to the old wall. Then, of course, the new wall was added to that and swung all the way around. So what we're seeing right there is the old footing and foundation of the original perimeter wall on the east side of the institution.
This is the wood shop area. The inmates would enter where the stairs are. That gate would be controlled by the officer up on the powerhouse wall in the tower. He would get the signal from the officer that's working in the wood shop when to open and close the door. A lot of the furniture that was manufactured here was manufactured for state institutions by inmates.
We are standing between the 2 of the factory buildings that was tied together at some point in time, but this is a 4-story building that was erected between the periods of 1880 and 1888. The building to the right was originally opened as a shoe factory and was operated by private enterprise. The next building over was a tobacco factory that was operated by private enterprise. But the building, after the work programs was taken over by the state, it was used for a multitude of industries such as woolen mills, cotton mills, knitting mills, the tag plant, the metal shops, the furniture factories, and shoe factories. This is the oldest building at the institution. They also, in the earlier days, they made clothing for the Confederate soldiers at this place. On December the 14th of last year, the penitentiary was officially closed. That is, all the prisoners were moved out and that was the first time it had been emptied since 1865, when the Northern troops entered Richmond from the north. The population was 287, and when the North entered the city, the people that was responsible for the institution left and left the prisoners behind. They gathered up and looted the place, and they left also, and according to research, only about 87 of them was recaptured and brought back to the penitentiary. There's been a number of incidents at the penitentiary involving escapes, attempted escapes, and one of them occurred about 1980, I believe, and it occurred from the roof of that building. It's the fourth floor. That building has 4 floors, rather, and it occurred from the roof. I always like to tell the story that I left early because it's the beginning of the Christmas holidays. I left early that day to get ahead of the line at the liquor store when they called me in to say that they'd had an incident. An individual who had managed to get to the roof of that building had fashioned a homemade glider. He'd made it out of fairing strips, 1x2 strips, and bed sheets. And apparently he tried to run across that roof and sail over the wall. And of course, it didn't work, and he came down rather than going over, and he landed in the railings of the wall next to the guard tower and became entangled in the concertina wire around the wall. Luckily, of course, as I like to add to that story, if he'd have made it over the wall during the time of that heavy traffic, he'd have been a hood ornament on the Cadillac going down 2nd Street. All right, we're standing on the West Truck Gate Tower looking towards the power plant. The power plant was built in 1939. It has 3 boilers. One is a coal-fired, one is oil-fired, and one is gas-fired. The power plant, of course, generates all the steam heat throughout the institution, and as well as the emergency generators in case of power failure. This particular tower is one of the larger towers. It had a twofold purpose. One was to open the 2 truck gates, which is located down below, but also to observe the perimeter walls.
This is the southwest truck gate. This is where the inmates would enter and exit the institution. When they would enter the institution, the officer would check his weapon in with the officer in the office. Once his weapon is checked in, the officer that would be patrolling this area would call up to the officer up on the wall post, and he would then open the gate for the truck to enter. Once the van enters, before the doors would be unlocked on the van or truck, the officer would close the truck gate before any inmates were let out the van. The officer would make a complete inspection of the van with a mirror. He would check under the hood, inside the vehicle, and underneath the vehicle for any contraband being brought into the institution. And the same thing is done when the van departs the institution. Once the vehicle has been checked, the inmates are released out of the van in full restraints. They're released out of the van and placed in the holding cell that we have here in the truck gate for the inmates. Once they're placed in the holding unit, the van departs the institution, the door is closed, and the inmates are let out of the holding cell to report to their destination. This is another branch of the Department of Corrections, which is called the Probation and Parole Building. This is where inmates would come after they've been paroled, either on mandatory parole or discretionary parole.
This is cell building B. It was built and occupied in 1952. It's sitting on basically the same site as the women's quarters that was discontinued in 1939. This building was built with 500 cells. It's a 5-tier cell block. And in the basement of this building was some additional cells. There was a 28-cell unit that was used for various things, and there were some gang holding cells located in the basement. At the same time, back in 1956, at the same time, A building was divided into 4 sections, and the shower rooms were discontinued. The same was done to this building. This building had showers in the basement, and the showers was discontinued, and 1 shower stall placed in each tier of each of the 4 sections, decreasing the number of cells from 500 to 466 cells. Again, the building is divided into 4 parts in order to allow better security and better separation of the inmates assigned. The basic design of this building is the same as A building. Again, it had the perimeter walls, and the cells were sitting in the center of the building, and there's a space between the top of the cells and the ceiling. It was also necessary to put concertina wire at the top of the ceiling of the cells to prevent inmates from climbing over the top. But this is a different building in some ways in that it's bigger, the cells are bigger, it had all bar grill work in the front. There was more space between the cell and the outer walls that allowed for indoor recreation during the inmates' leisure time. And of course these cells was arranged with a different locking device. Every cell had an individual lock. It meant that you could pull a lever at the end of a tier and pull it halfway, and you could go along and open a cell individually. Or you could pull it all the way out and swing all of the cells in that particular tier. 10 or 12 years ago, it was customary to allow inmates to make telephone calls, but it was somewhat of an inconvenience in that the calls had to be scheduled, and the officers would make the calls for the inmates, and then lower, probably would make the call from one of the control stations and would lower the phone down to the inmate to talk to whoever it was that he had requested to speak to. The telephone companies put in, as a result of that, they put in individual telephones. They put several the base is still hanging on the walls. They would enable the inmate to make a call to anybody he wanted to. He simply would dial the number, and an operator would accept the call and place the call to whoever it was he called, and they would agree to accept charges. He could not receive a call, but in doing this, it allowed much more access to the telephones, and it relieved the officers of the responsibility of making the calls for the inmates. When the building was divided into the 4 sections, they also redesigned the center section of this. This particular section we're standing in is where the control station was located, and separate stairways was a place that was used for the staff only. This particular section here allowed the officers to go all the way from the floor to each of the tiers and all the way through a hatch door to the top of the cells.
As you see, there are just 1 flight of stairs in each section, but the inmates were so good that instead of going to the stairs, they would climb up and down the bars, as you see in a movie or something. Cigarettes in here were big sellers. Inmates in here operated stores within the section, and they would trade cigarettes as we do money on the street. Take, for instance, if I was an inmate and I operated a store, for 1 pack of cigarettes, I would give you a soda and a bag of potato chips, or 2 bags of potato chips, or 2 sodas for 1 pack of cigarettes. Take, for instance, if you came to me and wanted to borrow a pack, for each pack you would owe me 2 packs. But if you didn't pay me back on that day that you were supposed to, each additional day, it would go up an additional pack. They would also have pools, football pool, basketball pools, baseball pools, and the stakes could get anywhere from 400 to 500 packs of cigarettes. And if an inmate hit for 500 packs of cigarettes, that was like hitting the Virginia lottery in the state penitentiary. Each time an inmate moved into a different cell, he had the opportunity to paint the cell if he wanted to paint the cell. They would use different types of things in order to put different patterns on their wall. A lot of them were good artists anyway, so a lot of them could draw freehand and paint the picture after they drew it. And a lot of them would take things like a toilet paper roll and dip the toilet paper roll in the paint and maybe pat different types of patterns or design on their walls and things like that. Around the corners, where you cannot be seen by the officer up in the cage, was where a lot of incidents would take place. So the inmates wouldn't stay around the corner very long, so they couldn't be seen. They would hurry around the stairs so they could be in vision of the officer at all times, especially if he had an inmate. As we saw some of the weapons that were made by inmates, inmates are very smart, and you have inmates in here from all walks of life. You have some inmates in here operate businesses while they're still in the institution. You have some drug dealers who are still operating their drug gangs while they're still in the institution. So there are a lot of inmates in here who are very intelligent and who have a lot of money. Take, for instance, one particular inmate that I know, when he left the institution, he had approximately $100,000 on his account. As a matter of fact, the first time that I'd ever seen a $180 pair of Reebok pump sneakers was on an inmate.
Cell Block 3 was placed into operation in 1952. It's a self-contained building. That is, it has its own food preparation area, its own mess hall, and was built to operate independently from the rest of the institution. This building was built for a segregation building, segregation and isolation. It has 102 cells all total. The segregation section is 72 cells. It's 3 tiers, 12 cells on each side of each tier, and that was the segregation section. There was very little bit of recreation in this building. For the most part, the inmates assigned to this particular section were confined to the cells most of the time. They were reviewed by classification committees every 30 or every 90 days to determine if they was felt that they could re-enter a general population at this institution or other institutions. But during the normal movements, the showers, when they left their cells and they'd be handcuffed, taken from the cells to the shower, and they'd be placed in the showers and a padlock placed on the shower to protect them from other inmates and protect other inmates from them. The expanded metal that's on the second and third tiers, this is the 3-tier cell building, is not there to provide additional security. It's to prevent the inmates from throwing soap and toilet paper made into bowls at the windows and breaking the windows. Inmates love to break out windows.
In C building, it houses 3 different categories of inmate: protective custody, segregation, and isolation. Protective custody is the section where inmates are allowed to check themselves in if they feel they need protection from another inmate. But once you get into protective custody, it's not up to you to check yourself out. Then it's up to the administration to release you when they feel that it's safe for them to release you. Segregation is basically the same thing, only you do not check yourself in. You are placed over here by the administration. They can place you over here for administrative investigation, or if you've committed an infraction within the institution, they could punish you by bringing you over here and place you in segregation. They are not allowed to have televisions inside their cells or inside the building. All they have in their cells are legal materials, religious material, and cosmetics. You can see that they have like wire on the cell doors. That's to prevent the inmates from throwing anything out of their cells on the officers or onto the floor. Take, for instance, you do have some inmates who are known to throw feces and urine on the officers or on other inmates.
This is the isolation section of the maximum security building, cell building B. It has 30 cells, and the inmates that are housed in this section were placed here for 15-day periods for institutional violations by an institutional adjustment committee. The cells are in the lower section of the building, and it's designed with 2 doors, 2 outer doors, a bar grill door and a solid door, with a port for observation without entering the cells. The utility space and the light was located in the back of the cell in a utility section. So actually the cell is in 3 different sections, each cell.
Inmates are allowed by law to have 3 showers a week, 3 square meals a day, and 3 hours recreation per week. Once an inmate enters this area, he is the majority of the time considered a danger to the general population and to the population in the building. So he's brought down here and totally isolated from any other inmates.
There's another building identical to this, is located at Powhatan, and it's an exact overlay of this same building, used for the exact same purposes. We once had an inmate in that particular facility that was very strong. He could spring bars and he could walk up walls, and we found it necessary to secure some of the cells by putting expanded metal and making it a little bit tighter so that the subject couldn't get to the cell bars so easily. And during the process of doing this, the maintenance people that was trying to rebuild the cell or secure the cell indicated at the end of the day that it was awfully difficult to do that because this subject owns in the cell across the hall spent the greater part of the day sitting on the ceiling. Now, this was a man, of course, that could place his feet and hands against the walls, and he would literally walk up the wall backwards and pretend like he was sitting on the ceiling. And of course, every institution in the state at that time had a cell designed for people like him or that person in particular. When the women's quarters was located here, it was torn down or discontinued in 1939 and torn down in 1940 when B building was placed under construction. But this entire area was open until they built C building in 1952. C building was constructed and a separate wall was built to enclose C building. Also, the remaining wall was raised about 5 to 6 feet above what it was when this was a recreation field. The plastered part of the wall was the original wall, and the female quarters, the back part of the female quarters was where the plaster part ends, as you can see to the west. Prior to 1908, the executions in the Commonwealth was the responsibility of the local authorities. That is, if a person was sentenced to be executed out in one of the counties, it was the responsibility of the sheriff, and the execution was carried out by hangings. In 1908, the General Assembly turned that responsibility over to the state, and therefore the execution chamber in the holding area was constructed. The law went into effect on July 1, 1908. And this area was built in the basement of the A building that had been built in 1904, and it has 9 cells. In the earlier days of executions, probably there never was over 1 or 2 inmates housed in this particular area, although at one point in time there was probably as many as 7 or 8, as they had a group called the Martinsville 7 that was executed within 2 days apart.
This is the death chamber. This is not death row. Death row is in Mecklenburg Correctional Center. That's where we house the death row inmates. We bring them here 15 days prior to execution. There are 2 officers down here observing the inmates. They observe the inmates' every move. Everything that the inmate does is documented. Everything that the inmate is given is documented. Take, for instance, when he's given lunch, whatever's on the tray is documented. What he eats and what he does not eat is documented. If the inmate lays in bed all day, every 15 minutes you will write in a logbook where the documentations are written. You will write in there, the inmate is in bed, appears to be asleep. Every 15 minutes, as long as the inmate stays in bed, you will log down his activity. When the inmate goes to the restroom, that's logged down. The only people that are allowed down here to visit the inmates are attorneys and clergy. The day of the execution, at approximately 8:30, they will remove the inmate from the cell, shave his head, and shave his right ankle. They would offer the inmate a shower or give him a shower. They would place him in the jumpsuit that he's going to be executed in, which has Velcro instead of the zipper and the buttons. They will replace the zippers and buttons with the Velcro lining so that during execution, he would not be burned by the zipper or the buttons. The inmate is also offered a last meal. They tried to grant his last meal request. One of the Briley boys, he ordered a Big Mac from McDonald's. An inmate we had named Wilbert Evans, he ordered pig feet, potato salad, cornbread, and collard greens. As a matter of fact, during the course of the time he was down here, he requests pork for every meal, as a matter of fact. And during the execution, he had a nosebleed, which was caused by high blood pressure, being he ate so much pork during the course of the time he was down here.
After the shower is completed, the inmate is moved from shower room to cell 1. And just prior to 11 p.m., the warden will enter the execution chamber. He will come to this cell, read the court order to the inmate, then he's escorted from this cell into the execution chamber. Just before the inmate's taken out of the cell to be brought from cell 1 to be brought into the execution chamber, the witness will already have been escorted in and seated in the witness booth, and they will have observed the chair being tested for their benefit. When the subject is brought into the execution chamber, the director will be standing at the outer door, and the warden will be standing at this particular column with the key. The execution is made up of a team of 9 individuals, and that it covers the persons assigned to the control room and those assigned to strap the individual in the chair, as well as those assigned to escort the individual from the cell 1. But when he's placed in the chair, his arms are strapped to the arms of the chair, and the strap goes across his midsection, a strap across his chest, his ankles is strapped to the chair, and then a metal headpiece that's lined with natural sponge is placed on his head with a strap that comes around under his chin. He's pushed back to the chair with a leather face mask is pulled over his face. A terminal from this upper terminal down to the top of the headpiece and a cable from the leg piece over to the bottom terminal is fixed. The headpiece and the leg piece is lined with natural sponge. And of course, prior to it being used, it's been placed in a briny solution and laid out to drip. This enables a better contact, and when the headpiece is placed on the subject, then water will not stream down over his face. It has to be natural sponge because artificial sponge will not hold the moisture that's required to make the electrical contact, only natural sponge.
Once he's placed in the chair, he's given an opportunity to say the last words that he has to say. The chair is made of oak, and the chair was also made by inmates. The members of the execution squad, they are volunteers. They do not receive any additional pay for this assignment.
Now, when the subject is brought in and seated in the chair, strapped in with his headpiece and face mask and the connections made, the director will be on the telephone to the governor's office, probably speaking to the chief of staff. When the director gets the okay from the governor's office, he will signal the warden. The warden will insert a key in this lock. When he turns that key, that activates the equipment behind the control panel, and the officer assigned to that area will push a button, and the current will enter the subject. The equipment will produce 2,500 volts, and it will enter the subject in a surge of 55 seconds. There will be a 55-second surge, a 5-second delay, another 55-second surge of current. The equipment will automatically cut off. The warden then will remove the key from the column, from the lock, and he'll wait at least 3 minutes, signal the physician who will examine the subject, pronounce him dead. The curtains will be drawn. The witnesses are moved out of the witness booth, and the medical team removes the subject from the chair. Between the periods of 1908 and 1962, there was 236 individuals executed in this chambers. Executions was put on delay for the next 20 years, and the next execution occurred in 1982. From 1982 to date, there's been 11 additional executions, making a total of 245. The last subject was scheduled to be executed on February the 22nd of this year, and that sentence was commuted by the governor. So the following Monday morning, which was yesterday, February the 25th, the chair was removed from this area and taken to the new institution in Greenville, the Greenville Correctional Center, where the new execution chamber will be located. When the warden inserts the key and turns it, that will activate this equipment, and the red lights will come on, and automatically when that happens, then the officer assigned to this room pushes the button. With the officer standing in this particular location, he can see the warden when the warden inserts the key, so he's already in a position to watch the red lights, but he cannot see the subject sitting in the chair.
This room here is called the cooling room. This is where they bring the inmate after he's been executed. The member of the execution squad, they remove the inmate from the chair, place him on a stretcher, and bring him into this room here. Once he's in this room, there are sandbags that are placed on the inmate in order to straighten him out. During the execution, for some apparent reason, the inmate body stiffens. So the doctor and the nurse, they place the sandbags on the inmate in order to straighten him out. The doctor also examines the inmate for any burns or anything of that nature that is caused by the execution. They also use baking soda on the inmate after he's been executed. His skin gets oily, so they use the baking soda to absorb the oil from the inmate's skin. The only part of the body that a death row inmate can donate after he's been executed would be his eyes, because the rest of his organs on the inside are destroyed during the execution.
In the earlier days of executions, this particular door had a twofold purpose. This was the area that the inmate sat here and had all of his visits through this screen from the adjacent visiting room. Also, after the subject was taken to the cooling room and removed, the body was passed through this door and taken up to the front entrance of the penitentiary and received by the family's undertaker. If you wandered around through the Department of Corrections right now, I think you would still find inmates that miss being at the penitentiary. In fact, I've heard recently that one of the newer institutions that just opened, that where some of these men were transferred to, that they would like to be back at the penitentiary. And it's not that this is a nicer place, but it had a certain effect in that it's been called several different things. It's referred to throughout the years as the walls, but it was all sort of hemmed in the city of Richmond. It was considered the flagship, and for many inmates that were pulling felon sentences, it was considered to be the place to go. It had a lot of advantages. At one time, even though the population was between 1,800 inmates, they all had work assignments through the factory building that we looked at, and cell house jobs, the mess hall. Almost every inmate had some type of work assignment that didn't consist of working out on the farms and the roads. Educational programs increased. The fact it was downtown Richmond, not always the most desirable place to have a prison, but it allowed itself for many educational programs from the local colleges and the schools, and so there were people here that graduated from school with 4-year degrees.
This institution here is like the caveman days compared to the new institution that we will be going to, which is Greenville. That institution is what we consider ultra-modern. Everything here is operated manually, where in Greenville everything is operated electronically and by computer. There are cameras located throughout the entire institution in Greenville, and here they're just basically mirrors and your senses.
I think everyone that's ever been here will miss it to some degree, but after a while, I think I can speak for most all the others that we're glad it's over. We're glad it's going to be torn down, and I, for one, look forward to seeing an open field with nice green grass.